The city of Detroit, once the beating heart of American industry, was now a place of contrasts. Grand, decaying buildings stood side by side with modern developments, and former factories had been repurposed into trendy lofts and art galleries. The air was cold, the sky a dull gray, and the streets were slick with the remnants of an early winter snowstorm. Amidst this city of transformation, the Ahmed family was starting anew. Farid was a man in his early 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a neatly trimmed beard that matched the sharp lines of his face. His deep brown eyes held a calm and quiet intensity, but they could quickly turn steely when angered. He had grown up in a small village in Syria, where he learned the value of hard work, loyalty, and family. He moved to the United States in search of a better life, and after years of struggle, had landed a job as a project manager at a prestigious construction firm. Though his life in America was far from easy, Farid held on to a sense of pride and determination, always striving to provide for his family. Today, Farid stood in front of their new home, an old brick house in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood of Detroit. It wasn't much by the standards of the wealthier suburbs, but it was theirs. It was a fresh start. The house, with its peeling white paint and rusted gutters, seemed to mirror Farid's feelings about his new life, full of hope, but burdened by the weight of past struggles. Layla, Farid's wife, was in her late 20s, a graceful woman of average height, with soft, olive-toned skin that seemed to glow in the winter light. Her long, jet-black hair cascaded in waves over her shoulders, and her dark brown eyes, often downcast, held a quiet sadness. Layla had grown up in the Middle East, and her early life had been marked by both beauty and hardship. She had always been the center of attention in her family, the cherished daughter with a bright future ahead. But when she married Farid, her life had become one of sacrifice, trading her dreams for the demands of motherhood and a new life in a foreign country. As she stood in the living room of their new home, carefully arranging their few belongings, Layla felt a strange sense of isolation. The house felt empty, the rooms too large, the walls too silent. She missed her family, the warmth of their bustling home back in Syria. But she also missed the simplicity of her old life. Here in Detroit, she was a stranger. The American lifestyle felt like a mask, a costume she wore to fit in, but underneath it, Layla struggled to find herself. She caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror as she passed, her pale blue scarf wrapped tightly around her neck to ward off the cold. Her eyes seemed distant, as if they were searching for something, anything, to make her feel at home. The silence of the house was broken when the sound of a car engine revving outside echoed through the street. Farid glanced at the clock. Kamal would be arriving soon. Kamal, Farid's older brother by 5 years, was a man of wealth and influence, a successful businessman who had built his empire from the ground up. Unlike Farid, who had worked his way up slowly and with difficulty, Kamal had always been the one with connections, the one who had been able to skip the struggles and leap directly into the life of luxury. When Kamal stepped out of his sleek black Audi SUV, he was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, his hair combed back neatly, and his face adorned with a confident smile. He had the look of a man who had everything, wealth, power, and charm, but there was something about his eyes that always made Farid uneasy. They were calculating, as if he was always weighing his next move. "Farid! Layla!" Kamal called out as he walked up the front steps, his voice booming with authority. "I see you're settling in well. How are you two adjusting to life in America?" Layla managed a tight smile, forcing herself to stand as Kamal entered. She felt the familiar mix of admiration and unease when she saw him. Kamal was charming, with a magnetism that drew people in, but there was always something unnerving about him. She had always respected him as Farid's older brother, but there was a distance between them, a boundary she never allowed herself to cross. Farid clapped his brother on the back. "It's good, Kamal. We're getting there. Slowly, but surely. Kamal took a long look around the living room, his eyes scanning the modest furnishings. Not bad. Not bad at all, he said, his voice laced with a touch of condescension. You're doing well, Farid, but I think it's time you think about moving up, huh? You can't live like this forever. Farid's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He had always respected his brother, but Kamal's words stung. Farid had worked hard for this house, and while it wasn't perfect, it was a step forward. But Kamal always seemed to push him, always seemed to remind him of what he didn't have. As the evening wore on, the tension between the three of them grew palpable. Kamal's visits were always like this, disguised attempts to remind Farid of his shortcomings. But for Layla, it was different. She couldn't help but notice how Kamal's presence seemed to unsettle her. There was something in his eyes, the way he looked at her, too long, too intensely, that made her uncomfortable. Yet, at the same time, there was a part of her that couldn't deny the attraction. Kamal was everything Farid wasn't: confident, assertive, worldly. It was the kind of man she had once dreamed of, before life had caught up with her. Kamal leaned in, his voice low as he spoke to Layla. "How are you, Layla?" "Settling in, okay? I know this must be hard for you. America can be a cold place, but you're strong. You'll adapt." Layla nodded, forcing a smile. "I'm fine. It's different. I miss home." Kamal's eyes softened, and for a moment there was a warmth in his gaze. "You're not alone, Layla. You have family here. And if you ever need anything at all, you know I'm always here." Farid glanced at his brother, sensing the tension between them but choosing to ignore it. Kamal's presence, while always felt, seemed especially heavy tonight. There was something in the air, a subtle shift that Farid couldn't quite place. As the evening wore on, Farid went to check on their son, Ayman, who was playing in the next room. Layla and Kamal were left alone, the silence between them thickening, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. Neither spoke, but the tension in the room was undeniable, and Layla couldn't help but wonder what the future held for them all, whether it would be filled with the promise of success or the dark shadow of something far more dangerous. And so, in the quiet of their new home, amid the warmth of family and the cold of the outside world, Layla couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change, in ways she didn't yet understand. The winter had finally loosened its grip on Detroit, but the chill lingered in the air. The streets were muddy from the thaw, and the trees still stood bare, as if the city itself was waiting for the warmth to return. For Layla, however, the true change wasn't in the weather. It was in the air inside her own home. Every glance, every word spoken, seemed to carry an unspoken weight. She felt it more acutely as the days passed, and it became clear that things between her and Kamal were beginning to shift. Layla had always been an elegant woman, with her grace and beauty evident even in the simplest of tasks. As she stood by the kitchen counter, chopping vegetables for dinner, her mind wandered. She felt the familiar, quiet hum of life moving around her. The sounds of Ayman's laughter in the other room, the soft thud of Farid's shoes as he walked through the hall. But something inside her had changed. There was a sense of unease she couldn't shake, a feeling that her life, which had always been predictable, was slowly slipping beyond her control. Her dark eyes flitted toward the clock. Farid wouldn't be home for another hour. She had become used to this, the hours alone in the house while he worked late into the evening. It gave her time to think, but sometimes, too much time. It allowed her to acknowledge things she had long tried to ignore. She thought of Kamal. Her relationship with him had always been polite, even friendly. But in the past few weeks, something had shifted. She had noticed his eyes lingering on her a little too long, the way his words seemed to have a new, deeper weight. He was far too charming, his presence too powerful, and in his company, Layla had begun to feel something stirring inside her, a dangerous feeling she hadn't experienced in years. It was a rainy afternoon when Kamal came to visit again. Farid was working late, as usual, and Layla had just finished cleaning up the lunch dishes when she heard the familiar rumble of Kamal's car pulling into the driveway. He was punctual, as always, and Layla couldn't help but feel a small flutter in her chest, despite herself. She shook her head, trying to dispel the feeling. Kamal was her brother-in-law, nothing more. When he entered, his smile was effortless, his presence commanding. "Layla, how are you today?" he asked, his voice smooth and warm, as if his words were caressing the air. "I'm good, Kamal. Just settling in." "You know how it is," she said, offering a small, polite smile. Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her apron, an unconscious, nervous habit. Kamal leaned against the kitchen counter, his eyes scanning her face as if reading her thoughts. "You know," he said casually, his gaze unwavering, "it's a shame Farid is working so much. You deserve more time for yourself. You've done so much for this family already." Layla felt a heat rise in her chest, a mixture of discomfort and something else she couldn't quite name. "It's fine," she replied quickly, her voice a little too sharp. "Farid works hard. We have to make sacrifices." Kamal stepped a little closer, his voice lowering slightly. "But you don't have to do it alone, Layla. You deserve more than just being a wife and mother. You're beautiful, smart. You could do so much more." She felt the pull of his words, as if they were reaching inside her, trying to awaken something that had been dormant for a long time. Layla could feel her breath catch in her throat, but she forced herself to smile. "I'm happy, Kamal. Really." But Kamal's expression didn't soften. Instead, he seemed to sense her unease, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he observed her. "I just want you to know, Layla, that if you ever need anything at all, I'm always here for you." The weight of his words lingered in the air like a perfume, sweet, yet overpowering. Layla shifted uncomfortably, feeling both drawn to and repelled by him in equal measure. She turned toward the stove, needing to break the tension, needing to find something, anything, to focus on. Days turned into weeks, and Farid's work schedule remained relentless. He was always tired when he came home, his eyes heavy, his words curt. Layla began to feel more and more isolated, as though the distance between them was growing with each passing day. Farid wasn't cruel, but his lack of attention had started to affect her in ways she hadn't expected. She tried to keep things normal, preparing meals, taking care of their son, managing the household. But there was a gnawing emptiness inside her that she couldn't ignore. She had always been proud of her role as a wife and mother, but now it felt like something was missing. One evening, as Layla prepared dinner alone, she heard the familiar sound of Kamal's car pulling up again. He was becoming a regular fixture in their home, a constant presence that made Farid's absence all the more pronounced. Layla greeted him at the door with a forced smile, feeling the familiar flutter in her chest as he stepped inside. His scent, rich and woodsy, seemed to follow him, leaving a trace in the air. "Farid still at work?" Kamal asked, his voice laced with mock concern. "Yes," Layla answered, trying to sound casual. "You know how it is." Kamal smiled, a smile that was all too knowing. "I do. But you don't have to be alone, Layla. I'm here. I'll always be here for you." Layla felt a tremor run through her at his words, but she quickly shook it off, focusing instead on the task at hand. She turned toward the stove, stirring the simmering stew, her movements quick and sharp. Kamal, however, wasn't one to be dismissed so easily. He took a step closer, his presence almost overwhelming. "Are you sure you're okay, Layla?" Kamal's voice was soft, almost intimate now. "I know how hard it must be, being so far from home, surrounded by strangers. You don't have to carry it all on your own." She could feel him behind her now, his breath just a little too close. Her pulse quickened. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know what to feel. "I'm fine, Kamal," she whispered, her voice strained. "I really am." But deep inside, Layla was no longer sure. The boundaries she had once kept so firmly in place, boundaries of loyalty, of love, of respect, were beginning to blur, to fade away. Kamal's presence, his constant attention, had started to erode something within her, something she hadn't even realized was fragile until it was almost gone. And as Kamal stood behind her, his presence filling the room, Layla knew that the invisible boundaries between them had already been crossed. It was only a matter of time before everything else would fall apart. The air had warmed, and the city's streets, once damp and dirty, now shimmered with the glow of the setting sun. The blooming flowers in front of Layla's house were a stark contrast to the turmoil that had quietly taken root inside her. The days felt longer, stretching on as she continued to walk the fine line between duty and desire, between loyalty and temptation. Kamal's presence had become an undeniable constant, like an insistent echo in the quiet moments of her life. It had begun innocently enough, a shared cup of tea here, a conversation about family there. But now, there was something palpable in the air when Layla and Kamal were alone. The easy familiarity had given way to something deeper, something unspoken, but impossible to ignore. The invisible boundary between brother-in-law and sister-in-law had been crossed, and Layla found herself on a path she never intended to take. One evening, as Farid worked late again, Layla found herself waiting for Kamal. He had called earlier, saying he would drop by to discuss some matters with Farid, but Layla knew he often came to her first. She wasn't sure if she wanted him to show up, or if she wanted to be left alone with her thoughts, but as the clock ticked past 8 p.m., she found herself standing in the kitchen, staring at the cutting board, her hands restless. A soft knock on the door broke her trance. Layla opened it to find Kamal standing there, his figure framed by the warm glow of the evening. He was dressed in a sleek suit, his dark hair perfectly combed, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his lips. His presence filled the space between them, larger than life, almost as if the world outside had momentarily ceased to exist. "Layla," Kamal said, his voice smooth, yet there was an edge to it. "I didn't think you'd be alone tonight." Layla stepped aside to let him in, her heart pounding in her chest. "Farid's at work," she replied, trying to sound casual, but she knew her voice betrayed her. "I see," Kamal said, his eyes flicking over her in a way that sent a shiver down her spine. He closed the door behind him, and for a brief moment, they stood in silence. The weight of his presence in the room was suffocating, yet she couldn't bring herself to ask him to leave. "I thought we could talk," he added, his voice low. "You've been distant lately, Layla. I've noticed." Layla's breath hitched slightly. She had become more distant. That much was true, but she didn't know how to explain it, how to explain the disquiet in her own soul, the war raging inside her. "I've just been busy," she said, her voice faltering. "With everything, it's just a lot." Kamal took a step closer, the space between them growing smaller. "I understand, but it's more than that, isn't it?" His words were soft, almost tender, but Layla could hear the underlying meaning. "You've been carrying the weight of it all alone." Her pulse quickened, but she didn't move away. She couldn't. It felt as though her body was no longer under her control, as if it were reacting to something deeper, something hidden within her. "I'm fine, Kamal," she whispered, though even she didn't believe it. But Kamal wasn't convinced. The heat of summer had settled over Detroit, the air thick with humidity, the sun relentless as it blazed down on the city streets. Inside the Ahmed household, the warmth felt stifling, both from the season and the tension that had been building over the past few months. Layla's once harmonious life had become a series of quiet fractures, the cracks becoming more visible with each passing day. Kamal's visits had become more frequent, and his presence, once subtle, was now impossible to ignore. The invisible boundary that had once separated them was now a gaping chasm, threatening to swallow them both. Farid had always been a hard worker, a man of principles, and yet lately he felt like he was drifting, like something was slipping through his fingers. He could sense it in the air when he walked through the door, an odd, unspoken tension. Layla seemed distracted, her eyes distant whenever he tried to speak to her, and there was something different about her when she greeted him. It was subtle at first, but it began to gnaw at him, a feeling of being on the outside of his own life. It started with small things, a missed glance, a slight hesitation in her voice, the way she would suddenly look away when he spoke to her. But then it grew. There were the late-night phone calls, the excuses to go out when she hadn't before, the moments when Kamal seemed to show up at the house for business, only to linger a little too long, a little too comfortably. Tonight, as Farid entered the house after another long day at work, he found Layla in the living room, sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. The light from the television cast a pale glow over her face, but her expression was unreadable. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, a knot forming in his stomach. He hadn't seen her like this in a long time. "Layla," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "We need to talk." She looked up, her face momentarily registering surprise before it softened into a mask of indifference. "What about?" Farid stepped into the room, his eyes fixed on her. "You've been distant lately," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know what's going on, but it's becoming hard to ignore." Layla's heart skipped a beat. She had expected this moment, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure what to say. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she looked away, a sense of guilt washing over her. "I've been busy, Farid," she said finally, her voice strained. "There's a lot going on, you know that." Farid's eyes narrowed, his suspicion growing. "Busy? You've been different, Layla. It's more than just that." He moved closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "What's going on? What are you hiding from me?" Layla flinched at the question. She hadn't meant for it to get to this point, hadn't expected Farid to see through her facade. She had always been able to protect her secrets, to keep her life compartmentalized. But now, it felt as though everything was starting to unravel. "Nothing's going on, Farid," she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "I'm just tired." Farid studied her for a long moment, his gaze piercing, trying to read her, trying to understand what was happening. Something inside him, a sense of unease, a deep-rooted instinct, told him that there was more to her words than she was letting on. But he couldn't push her too hard, not yet. He could feel the distance between them growing with every day that passed, and he knew that if he pushed too much, too soon, he might lose her forever. Later that night, as Layla lay in bed, she felt the weight of Farid's questions pressing down on her. She stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. How had it come to this? How had the once unshakable bond between her and Farid been reduced to this? She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the overwhelming sense of guilt that threatened to consume her. But then, she heard the familiar sound of the door opening, soft, tentative, and unmistakable. It was Kamal. She could feel his presence in the house even before he stepped into the room, the air around her thickening with his energy, his authority. He was a constant, and no matter how much she tried to push him away, he always seemed to find his way back to her. Layla turned her head toward the door, her heart racing. "Kamal," she whispered, her voice a mixture of anticipation and fear. Kamal didn't respond immediately. He stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment, as though measuring the space between them, weighing the tension in the air. Then he took a step forward, closing the distance between them, and sat down beside her on the bed. "I know what you're going through, Layla," he said softly, his voice low and comforting. "It's hard. The loneliness. The weight of being in a marriage where you feel invisible. You deserve more than this. You deserve more than him." The words, though spoken gently, pierced Layla like a dagger. She had heard them before, but tonight they seemed to carry a weight that they hadn't before. There was truth in Kamal's words, truth that she couldn't ignore any longer. She had tried to resist, tried to bury the feeling she had for him, but now it felt as though the dam was breaking, and she was powerless to stop it. "I don't want to hurt Farid," she whispered, her voice shaky, barely audible. "But I can't keep pretending that everything's fine when it's not." Kamal's hand reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You don't have to pretend anymore," he said softly. "I'm here for you, Layla, and I always will be." The words hung in the air between them, a promise, a temptation, and a curse. Layla's heart raced as she stared into his eyes, and for the first time she felt the weight of her own desires pressing against her. The boundary between right and wrong, between loyalty and betrayal, had long since faded. There was no going back, and just like that, she felt herself surrender. The next morning, Farid woke up to an emptiness in the house. Layla was in the kitchen, her movements mechanical as she prepared breakfast. There was a tension in the air that he couldn't ignore, a shift he couldn't quite place. "Layla," he began, his voice tentative, "we need to talk. I know something's wrong. Please, tell me what's going on." She paused for a moment, her back to him, her hands still on the counter. When she turned to face him, her expression was unreadable, a mask she had perfected over months of hiding her feelings. "I don't know what you mean, Farid," she said, her voice flat, emotionless. Farid felt his chest tighten. The distance between them, the unspoken words, had become too much. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, not when everything felt like it was slipping through his fingers. "You're lying to me," he said, his voice strained with frustration. "I can feel it. I can see it." Layla said nothing, her silence more deafening than any words. Farid's gaze darkened, his suspicion growing with every passing second. He took a step toward her, his anger bubbling to the surface. "I trusted you, Layla," he said, his voice low, barely controlled. "But now I'm starting to wonder if you ever really trusted me." The fracture that had been slowly forming between them now seemed irreversible. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating. Farid could feel the pain in his chest, the realization that the woman he loved, his wife, his partner, was slipping away from him piece by piece. Layla turned her gaze away, unable to meet his eyes. The guilt, the shame, the fear, they all weighed on her heart like a stone. But there was something else, something she couldn't ignore, the feeling of inevitability. The fracture had begun, and no matter how hard they tried, neither of them could stop the fall. The chill of fall had begun to creep into the air, the leaves on the trees shifting from green to shades of amber and red. The scent of change was in the wind, as if the world itself was preparing for something new. But within the Ahmed household, change had already come, and it was more destructive than anyone could have predicted. The lies that had once held everything together were now unraveling, and the truth, harsh, unforgiving, and raw, was about to surface in a way that none of them could escape. It was a Tuesday evening when Farid's suspicions, which had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks, finally erupted into a confrontation that could no longer be avoided. Farid had never been one for deception, but the fragments of doubt that had formed in his mind were now undeniable. His eyes had been opened in a way that left him feeling disoriented and betrayed. The subtle signs, the late-night meetings, the long phone calls, the looks that passed between Layla and Kamal had finally led him to one painful conclusion. Kamal had been the one to seal the truth. Fareed had come home early from work that day, driven by an overwhelming need to confront the growing distance between himself and his wife. He had intended to surprise Layla, but the surprise came in the form of a phone call he overheard from the living room. Layla's voice was softer than usual, almost whispering. "Kamal, I miss you. I can't stop thinking about you. Please." Fareed's heart stopped. He leaned against the doorframe, unable to process what he had just heard. The words felt like daggers, each one a betrayal more painful than the last. He had suspected something, but this? This was a revelation that shattered everything he had believed about his marriage. He didn't wait to hear more. Fareed's fists clenched, and he strode into the room, his presence overwhelming. "Layla," he said, his voice colder than it had ever been. "Tell me it isn't true." Layla turned toward him, her face pale, her hands shaking slightly. She had been expecting this, but she wasn't ready for it. Not like this. She could see the fury in Fareed's eyes, the deep hurt that only the truth could inflict. "Fareed, she began, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't lie anymore. Not when the truth was so glaringly obvious. She closed her eyes briefly, trying to collect herself, but it was too late. Kamal, who had been in the other room, stepped into the doorway, his presence like a shadow looming over them. Fareed's gaze snapped to him, and in that moment all the unspoken accusations came flooding to the surface. "This is what it's been about all along, isn't it?" Fareed said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You've been seeing her behind my back. You've been with her." Kamal didn't flinch. He met Fareed's gaze with a calm that made Fareed's blood boil. "It's not what you think," Kamal said, his voice almost too smooth, too controlled. "We didn't plan for this to happen. But you should know, Fareed, that Layla, she's been unhappy for a long time. I was just there for her when she needed someone." Fareed's eyes hardened. "You think this is some kind of excuse? You think I haven't noticed that something's wrong? How long, Kamal? How long have you been lying to me?" Layla felt the walls closing in around her. She had been holding on to a fragile thread of denial, but now there was no escaping the reality of what she had done. She had betrayed her husband, and worse, she had allowed herself to fall deeper into something she could never take back. "I'm sorry, Fareed," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted this. But I can't undo what's been done. I can't change it." Fareed's expression was unreadable as he took a step back. The words didn't feel real to him. He had never imagined that the woman he loved, the woman he had given his life to, could betray him so completely. The thought of it was suffocating. His breath hitched, and for a moment, he was speechless. "I never wanted this," he repeated, his voice rising in disbelief. "You think I wanted to be in this situation? You think I wanted to find out like this, with no warning? You lied to me for months. You, both of you, used me." Layla's face flushed with shame. Kamal, on the other hand, remained impassive, his eyes cool and steady, as if he had already reconciled with the mess they had made. "Fareed," Kamal said, his voice softer now, "sometimes things happen. We don't always have control over them." "Control?" Fareed spat, his anger growing. "What does that even mean? You have control over what happens in this house, don't you?" The pain was evident in Fareed's voice, his trust shattered. He had given everything to this family, and now it felt like it had all been in vain. Layla stepped forward, her hands trembling as she reached for him, but he recoiled, stepping away from her. "Don't," he said, his voice low, almost broken. "Just don't." Fareed's heart was heavy, a weight that seemed to press on his chest, threatening to suffocate him. Layla stood there, tears streaming down her face, but he couldn't bring himself to comfort her. He had seen the betrayal in her eyes, and it was too much to bear. She had broken his trust, and now there was nothing left to say. "I gave you everything," Farid whispered, his voice a mixture of sorrow and fury. "Everything. And this is how you repay me?" Layla's lips quivered, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She had never meant to hurt him this way. She had never wanted it to come to this. But it had. The choice was no longer hers. The truth was out. "I didn't mean for it to happen, Farid," she said, her voice desperate. "But I've been so lost. And Kamal was there. He understood me in ways you couldn't. I didn't know what else to do." Farid's eyes flicked to Kamal, his expression a mix of contempt and disbelief. "So this is what it's come to?" "My own brother, you, Kamal?" he asked, his voice a low growl. Kamal didn't look away. "I never meant to hurt you, Farid," he said, his tone calm, measured. "But what's done is done. There's no going back." The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Farid stood there, numb, as the weight of what had happened settled into the pit of his stomach. He had always thought that family was sacred, that nothing could come between the bond he shared with his wife, with his brother. But now, that bond was shattered beyond repair. There was no forgiveness here, no reconciliation. Farid turned and walked out of the room without another word. His steps were heavy, the finality of the situation hanging in the air. Layla stood motionless, her heart breaking into a million pieces. She had lost him. There was no coming back from this. And as the door slammed shut behind him, the truth was finally clear. The damage had been done, and there was no one left to heal the wounds. The cold wind howled through the streets of Detroit, and the city seemed to shrink under the weight of the season. Snow had begun to fall, blanketing everything in a layer of white, as if the world was trying to cover up the wounds that had been inflicted in the months that had passed. Inside the Ahmed household, the warmth of the fire flickered, but it offered no comfort. The house felt colder than ever, and the silence between Farid and Layla was suffocating, thick with the realization that their world was beyond repair. Layla sat in the living room, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. She had been waiting for Farid to come home, to somehow, against all odds, make it right. But the longer she waited, the more she realized that it was too late. Farid had left, not physically, but emotionally. She could see it in his eyes the last time they spoke. He was done with her. The trust was gone, replaced by a cold emptiness that neither of them knew how to fill. Her heart ached with the weight of her choices. She had let herself fall into Kamal's arms, thinking that his comfort would fill the void in her heart, but all it had done was create a deeper rift, one that couldn't be bridged. The distance between her and Farid felt like an insurmountable chasm, and no matter how much she tried, she couldn't cross it. She had betrayed him, and now she was paying the price. Kamal's absence, too, weighed heavily on her. After the confrontation, he had disappeared, leaving her with the aftermath of their actions. She had expected him to stay, to be the support she desperately needed, but instead, he had vanished without a trace. And now, she was alone. The house that once felt like a home now felt like a prison. Every corner, every piece of furniture seemed to mock her. There was no going back. She had destroyed everything. She stood up and walked toward the window, looking out into the snow-covered street. The quiet was unbearable. The silence between her and Farid, the silence between her and herself, seemed to stretch on forever. The isolation felt like a physical weight, pressing down on her chest. Farid had been walking the streets of Detroit for hours. His thoughts were a whirlwind, his emotions in a storm. He couldn't stop thinking about the betrayal. He couldn't stop hearing the words they had said to each other, seeing the way Layla had looked at Kamal, and the cold indifference in her eyes when she had finally admitted the truth. He had tried to make sense of it, to understand how everything had gone so wrong. But there was no explanation, no justification for what had happened. Layla's infidelity was a wound that he couldn't heal, a scar that would never fade. Fareed had spent the past few days in a haze, unable to sleep, unable to eat. His mind was consumed by thoughts of revenge, of retribution, but also of regret. Regret for trusting her, regret for believing that love was enough to hold their marriage together. He had spent so many years sacrificing his own happiness for the sake of his family, and now it felt like all of it had been in vain. His heart ached with the loss of his wife, of his family, of everything he had once believed in. He had thought that love could conquer all, but now that belief had shattered, leaving him empty and broken. As he walked aimlessly through the snow-covered streets, Fareed's mind began to spiral. He knew that he couldn't live with this pain forever. He couldn't bear the thought of seeing Layla every day, knowing what she had done. And yet, there was a part of him that still wanted her, still yearned for the life they had built together. It was a cruel, insidious thought, but it was there. His phone buzzed in his pocket and he pulled it out, seeing that it was Layla's name on the screen. He paused for a moment, staring at the phone, unsure of whether or not to answer. He hadn't spoken to her in days, and the thought of hearing her voice again stirred a mix of emotions, anger, pain, and a deep sadness that he couldn't explain. Finally, he pressed the green button and brought the phone to his ear. "Fareed," Layla's voice came through, shaky and small. "I need to see you." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been avoiding her, running from the situation, but now he knew that it was time to face the truth once and for all. Fareed made his way back home, his feet heavy with each step. When he arrived, the house was eerily quiet. Layla was waiting for him in the living room, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red from crying. The sight of her, so vulnerable and broken, made his heart ache in a way he couldn't describe. "Fareed," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. I don't know how to fix this. I've ruined everything." He stood at the doorway, his gaze fixed on her. The anger that had consumed him for days was now replaced with a cold detachment. As if he were watching someone else's life unfold before him, he had no energy left to fight, no will to make things right. He was simply tired. "Layla," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know if I can ever forgive you. What you did, I can't erase it, and I don't think I ever will." The words hit her like a blow. She had hoped, foolishly, that there might still be a chance for them, that they could find a way to move past the betrayal. But the finality in his voice crushed that hope. It was over. The end had come, and there was no going back. Layla stood up, her hands trembling as she reached for him, but Fareed stepped back, shaking his head. "Don't," he whispered. "Please, just don't." There was nothing left to say. No more explanations, no more apologies. Just the empty space between them, a distance that had grown too wide to bridge. Later that night, Fareed sat in his car, parked in front of the house. His mind was spinning, the weight of everything that had happened threatening to crush him. He couldn't escape it. The betrayal, the lies, the hurt. It was all too much. He felt like he was drowning in it, like the pain was consuming him from the inside out. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Layla. "I'm sorry, Fareed. I don't know how to live with myself anymore. I've lost you. I've lost everything." Fareed read the message, his heart sinking. He had hoped that Layla would find a way to pick up the pieces of her life, that she would somehow make it through this. But now it was clear that she was just as lost as he was. He reached for the door handle, his hand trembling. He needed to see her one last time, But before he could open the door, he felt something shift inside him, something dark and overwhelming. The weight of the past few days, the pain, the regret, the loss, had built up to a point where he couldn't carry it anymore. He made a decision then, a decision that would haunt him forever. The next morning, the snow was heavier than before, blanketing the city in a cold, indifferent silence. The police arrived at the Ahmed household early, the flashing lights casting eerie shadows over the front yard. Inside, Layla was sitting on the couch, her eyes hollow, staring at the empty space before her. Fareed had left a note, but it was too late. He had chosen to end it all, leaving behind a life that had been shattered beyond repair. Fareed had taken his own life, the weight of the betrayal and the unbearable pain too much to carry. Layla's world collapsed in an instant, her heart breaking in ways she never thought possible. She had lost him, forever. And with his death, she had lost everything. The truth, once revealed, had torn them apart. And now, there was nothing left but the bitter aftermath of their choices. In the cold light of morning, Layla was left alone in a world she no longer recognized, haunted by the tragic consequences of her actions. And in the distance, the snow continued to fall, a silent witness to the end of a once beautiful life.